Hello and welcome to Stafford Connect. I'm Tom Cohen. Our topic for discussion on this episode is one we'll likely return to in future episodes: growth. Of course, when we're talking about growth, we're really talking about one thing: population. Suburban communities like Stafford are currently experiencing unprecedented population growth as people leave crowded areas for a better quality of life. And that surge in population represents more than just an increase of residents. It's a complex transformation that affects every aspect of government and community life. Local governments face struggles while populations grow faster than the government officials can easily keep up with it. Adjusting to a larger population presents challenges with infrastructure, community service delivery, constituent services, budgeting, and much more. So local governments try to manage the growth with processes like strategic planning. Sometimes they do a really good job at staying ahead of the growth curve, and sometimes they don't. But no matter what, it often results in a complicated discussion about growth projects as officials and developers wrestle with how to manage the growth of a community in a sustainable and efficient manner. And that's the backdrop for this episode and any other dealing with development in Stafford County. One project currently under discussion is in the southern end of the county, a campground off of Belle Plains Road. This project would have tents, cabins, recreational amenities, parking for vehicles, and overnight and/or multiple night stays. The developer in this instance is attempting to do this project as by right. Those not familiar with Virginia or zoning may not be familiar with the term by right. Some states have the concept of home rule, which means that the locality can restrict development if the infrastructure is not in place. That would mean that a locality could deny homes or businesses, for example, if the road network or utilities or schools cannot handle the additional growth. Virginia has a different system. It's a Dillon rule state. This is a court decision that, in short, says that local governments only have the powers that the state legislature has granted them. This would mean that if a person has 30 acres, for example, that is zoned a certain way that allows single-family homes, then the landowner is allowed to go forward with that residential project by right. They don't need approval from either the Planning Commission or the Board of Supervisors. If you've driven through Hartwood, you've seen this in practice. The landowner wants more homes, they would have to get a rezoning from, say, agricultural zoning to residential. Under current Stafford policy, by right restricts homes to one house per 6 acres. A rezoning could allow smaller size lots and therefore more homes. This concept applies to businesses as well. Each zoning category allows certain uses by right. Some uses are also allowed by conditional use permits. So the Belle Plains Campground Project is attempting to use what they're allowed to as by right under the current zoning on the land. As I noted earlier in the opening, development projects often result in complicated discussions as communities and groups present their concerns. And this project is no different. A community group has formed in opposition to the proposed project and has asked the Board of Supervisors and the Planning Commission to reject it. This is according to an article in the Fredericksburg Free Press on May 3rd. Our guest on this episode does not formally represent either of the groups concerned, the developer or the opposition. He is instead merely a concerned citizen who believes that discussions about growth and development are important, which is why he agreed to come on our program and join the conversation. I would note, however, that we invited representatives from both the developers and the opposition group to come and join us in this discussion, but they declined. That being said, I'm pleased to welcome our guest, Mr. Brad Hatch. Welcome to the program, Brad. Thanks for sharing your time.
Thanks for having me, Tom. I'm delighted to be here today.
Oh, great. So I thought we'd get things started by giving you some time to sort of introduce yourself to the Stafford community. A lot of us down in the southern part in White Oak area know you, but for the greater part of Stafford, give us some information.
Sure. I'm a lifelong resident of the White Oak area. Grew up there, raised on a farm not too far from the studio here, and live not too far from Old White Oak Church, which is a pretty prominent landmark down there. I guess I'll start with my education. I earned my BA from the University of Mary Washington in historic preservation. Then went on, earned an MA in anthropology and historical archaeology from the College of William and Mary, and finally earned a PhD from the University of Tennessee in anthropology. I am a Cultural Resources and National Environmental Policy Act manager for the Navy. That's what I do for my day job. And I am also an enrolled citizen of the Potomac Indian Tribe, and I sit on the tribal council. So that's what I do on a lot of my time off.
Wow. And just so people know, what's the anthropology, since you have several degrees in it?
Sure. Anthropology is the study of humans. So we're actually, in many ways, a multidisciplinary field that relies on history, material culture, folklore, oral history, just about any way you can study human beings, biology, linguistics. We draw on all those things.
And just sort of as an aside, notice, because teach government and history, there's been a great emphasis and a shift in the last 15, 20 years to go from everything has to be written history to understanding that certain cultures didn't, and they used oral histories.
Right. Yeah, and that's a big part, I think, of anthropology's influence in modern day culture, is that we have kind of moved away from this very colonial way of looking at the world to a more, I would say, a more diversity of opinions, really, and diversity of perspectives when it comes to examining not only the past but the present and how cultures and people have changed over time.
All right, and almost to a certain degree. Now that people are texting and doing things by text, which is poor grammar and whatnot, that's going to shift again just because of the people being people.
Absolutely. Yeah. There are so many things that aren't recorded on a piece of paper that happen in our everyday lives. If we were to sit down and catalog everything we do and say and think and how we interact with people and really sort of analyze how much of that is written down or recorded in any official way, I think we'd come to the realization that, there's very little of what we do that's recorded.
You mentioned things about being recorded, so we're recording this today. The Fredericksburg Free Press reported in May that a group of concerned citizens had formed, in their words, to oppose the Crow's Nest Outdoor Adventure Project on Belle Plains Road. People throughout the county have commented to me of seeing the little yard signs and other signs about the Belle Plains Road project. Now, you're not the spokesperson for the group, but you are aware of the different things of it. So maybe you could offer us your thoughts on why you believe that this is an important conversation for our community to have.
Yeah, so I think this is an important topic because I think it really gets at trends that have been happening within the county and the region in a broader sense over the past half century or so, with development and zoning and perhaps the appropriateness of zoning in certain areas, and how traditional communities have dealt with, or maybe things have been forced upon them to deal with in terms of these kind of projects. So I think it really gets at the interplay between those tensions between business, development, commerce, and progress versus community and traditional life ways, sort of the agricultural kind of organization of communities and tight-knit communities, and how those are, I don't want to say they're being pushed out necessarily, but it's getting more difficult to maintain those kind of communities as the region grows.
Right, and that's from I hate to say the anthropological attitude, which I'm sure I mispronounced, but that's sort of the history of our country. Is it has shifted from a mainly agrarian culture to, as cities have grown, and then suburbs and things. So it's an ongoing situation that just is sort of now pushed its way into our community in our area.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, all you have to do is kind of look at how development has progressed here in the United States and compare it to places like Europe. I think they've got a much better handle on how to develop things because they've had to deal with it for a longer time. You've got small towns and you've got countryside that sort of surrounds. Here, that boundary is a little more fluid in that you have cities, and then especially here in Northern Virginia, you have these like megalopolis kind of developments. I mean, it's, from essentially Boston all the way down to Richmond is like almost one large city that sprawls and has a lot of, things like the suburbs and little towns like Fredericksburg, but then larger cities like DC. And then there's some agricultural communities that are kind of stuck in there in little places, and they're becoming islands in a lot of ways.
Right. Interesting. So let's just talk about the campground project. The plans for the project have been submitted to the county, and they can be found on the county's planning and zoning website for anybody that's really interested to look at them, the latest edition. So what is your understanding of the project at this time? Granted, we're doing this in the beginning of July, and it has changed as staff has given them different things to work on.
Yeah, so right now my understanding is that it is essentially a phased project, and that the phase, what would be the first phase of it, includes tent camping sites in the associated infrastructure, so things like roads, a bathhouse, an office, stuff like that. And right now, it seems that is sort of what will fit with the by right portion of development, which does not really require any community input in terms of, there's no change in zoning or anything like that that's required. So there's less of a bar to have to reach when you're doing that kind of development.
Right. And as I've said in the opening, that if it's because we're a deal and rule state and things by right, if it's zoned a certain way, they can do it, and it just goes to staff, and staff will just say, this is what the rules say, versus if it's a rezoning, that's when the public gets input and says, well, what about X, Y, and Z? But you said it's a two-phase project. So do we have any idea what their second phase is?
Yeah, well, in following it kind of online and sort of through the rumor mill, et cetera, the second phase seems to be a little more nebulous. Is it more tent camping sites? Is it sites with hookups for things like water, sewer, electric? And then, if there are sites like that, does that mean that there would be potentially RVs? It seems to have gone back and forth. What it is at this very moment, I'm not 100% sure, but it certainly seems to be phased. And phasing projects it's a pretty effective way to get things through a process where you don't have to have that same level of scrutiny. And so I think it's important to understand when you see a phased project that oftentimes it's done that way because there are things that perhaps the person who is advocating the project is trying to avoid.
Right, and we've run into that on residential development in other parts of the county, or business development in different parts of the county. So it's one of the continual struggles. There was, it used to be that any, even by right, would go, if it was over, I think it was over 25 units, or below 20, would go to the planning commission. And then Governor McAuliffe signed a bill that said if it's 25 unit homes or less, it didn't. It just went to staff. And then what we have seen is the developer and those residentials would come in with 25, and then 25 right next door, 25. So you have a 75 home subdivision, but it came in under the thing so that there was never any public access or input. So we've seen that in many different ways over the last decade. All right, so it's clear that any development is going to have an impact on the community where it's located. And of course, we can expect some difference of opinions about that. So let's look at some of those impacts one at a time. Traffic safety. Residents of Belle Plains, like yourself, have been concerned for some time on the safety of the road down there. And having been down there and done ride-alongs with fire and rescue, I'm pretty well acquainted with the width of the road. So Belle Plains is a typical rural road in Stafford. How has the width of the road been handling the existing traffic?
Yeah, so the main traffic that you have going down Belle Plains these days that can create issues sometimes really is a reflection of how it's a reflection of the practices of the community that live down there and sort of how it's been for a very long time. There are, there's tractors, so there's farm equipment, and they can be quite wide depending on the type of farm equipment they are. And it's a narrow, like you said, a narrow little road with very narrow or non-existent shoulders in some places. The other kinds of traffic that are down there, besides just people going to and from their houses, are boats on trailers. There's a boat club down at the end of the road there, and there's also boat launches for commercial fishermen. And then going along with the commercial fishermen, there are fish trucks that come down there to collect the catch and take them to places to be sold. And of course, they're big, like semi trucks in some instances, and they're quite wide, and it's a curvy road as well. There are some sections that are kind of flat and straight, but there are some sections that have pretty sharp turns on them. And even with the speed limit being roughly 35 miles an hour through most of it, although a lot of people don't really obey that speed limit, it can be tricky and it can be dangerous. It can be really dangerous when you meet a tractor, you meet a semi truck, or even a boat with a trailer, like a larger trailer on it. Can be pretty dangerous. And the folks that live down there, that have been living down there for years, still have issues with that road and navigating it, and they drive slow and they pay attention. I mean, it's just kind of a dangerous road.
Right, and talking to school bus drivers, that school buses have an issue with just all these roads in Stafford that are pretty narrow, and they're not on any plan to get widened because there's not that great amount of traffic on them, and there's a finite amount of resources. So, do you put it on White Oak, which gets loads of traffic, or do you put the money on Belle Plains? And so it's one of those questions of priorities. So what would be the concerns with the project? Either in the phase one, might as well just do the phase one now, but phase one-ish, and then if it goes into something different.
Sure. Yeah. So the concerns have to do, I think, mainly with some of the things we've touched on already: width of the road, speed, and people obeying the speed limit. And then also, I think, a general familiarity with the road. A campground, the whole point is to bring people in who maybe aren't familiar with the area and to let them enjoy what the area has to offer. And that sounds like a good idea on the surface, but when you don't really have the infrastructure to handle that kind of thing, it can create problems for the people that live there and also for the people that are coming to visit. I think, if you were to widen the road a little bit, it might help. But I think you still kind of run into those issues with having slow-moving farm equipment, slow-moving fish trucks, slow-moving trailers, and things like that are coming down the road. And if, you get somebody who's not used to living in a rural community, and I see this more and more the older I get. My grandfather used to drive down the road at like 25 or 30 miles an hour, like from home all the way down to Belle Plains. And, back when he was doing that everybody did that. Like, it wasn't a big deal. But these days, if you're driving like 25 or 30 miles an hour on Ferry Road or on White Oak Road, people are going to run you over. It's dangerous. And I don't know what the answer to that is. Again, that has to do, I think, with the familiarity of people with a place. And so how do you remedy that? I don't know.
Yeah, really. I've experienced that going to and from work on Brook Road.
Yeah.
I know it, so I feel comfortable, whereas somebody else who doesn't, it goes slower, which is what I do when it's a road I don't know.
Yeah.
Drives people crazy. I used to pull over and let people go by me. I still do that, and people just don't understand that. And I'm like, yeah, you know where you're going. I'm getting out of your way. So water and sewer. Belle Plains is not currently on the county water and sewer system. So let's talk about the water and sewer concerns for a minute. What are your concerns about this project and the water and sewer down there?
Yeah. So, well, first, I guess let's start with water. Since there's no county water going down there, any water would need to be taken, from a well. And I think there are concerns there with the Potomac aquifer, and it's been drawing down for quite a while now. And adding something like a campground with potentially a splash pad and a bathhouse and all this stuff, something that creates a lot of water usage, would be concerning to the people that are living nearby who draw on that aquifer. If the aquifer's already dropping, does this create a larger issue? And then do people's wells start to go dry nearby? I don't know for sure, but I think this is something that probably should be explored and have somebody who does hydrology take a look at it. Sewer, has another set of issues. Obviously, the county sewer is not down there. As a matter of fact, a lot of the southern part of Stafford County, where I live, doesn't have county sewer. And so that leaves you with the option of doing a septic system. And septic systems, there's a lot of options these days, actually, when it comes to septic systems. There's all kinds of alternative systems and great things that, where you can put systems where you used to not be able to put them. But the concern with having a large septic system right next to the creek there is that what if it fails, or what if it overflows, or what if something happens and then you get all that, septic runoff into Potomac Creek, which is a body of water that's already really struggling in terms of its health. And adding more contaminants to the water is a bad thing all around, not only for the general health of like the wildlife, fish, and the just the quality of the water, but also the people that make a living from the water, like commercial fishermen. I mean, if it gets to the point where like, you can't catch crabs or anything like that out of there anymore, people, what are they going to do for a living? And that's a tradition that people have had down there, and an economic way of life that they've had for hundreds of years.
Well, and it's interesting because if people aren't familiar with down there, the idea of commercial fishermen and women going down there and fishing off that is sort of alien to what people sort of think about. I think somebody that's going fishing is just a couple of people going out with their lines, but this is actually far more of a business, which is sort of an interesting thing that people just aren't aware of because it doesn't get a lot of attention.
Especially up here, I think, further down on the northern neck, people are more familiar with watermen and sort of that lifestyle. But up this way, there's very few watermen left. And I think it's because of the development that's happened. And, impacts to water quality also affect recreational fishermen pretty heavily. Mm-hmm. I mean, the fish species suffer, and all of a sudden you don't have people that want to go there and fish for bass because there are no bass or anything like that.
Right. And so and I'm not too familiar with campgrounds, but so if I went with a tent and then at the middle of the night I have to go somewhere, obviously there's going to be something. There's not going to be porta potties. There's going to be some type of structure that I'm going to go that's going to go into their septic tank type thing. That's sort of the idea of these things in general. Maybe not this one, but I mean, is that sort of how that works?
I believe so. And I'm pretty sure there's a bathhouse that's in the plans, maybe even in the first phase. And so, yeah, a bathhouse would be like you almost think of it like a hall bathroom in college. So it will have, not only toilets, but also shower facilities and sinks and things like that.
Wow. All right. Do you think there's anything that the county or the developer could do to mitigate those concerns about the water and the sewer?
Well, for the water, you could almost, and I don't know how much the county can step in on this, but you could sort of limit the amount of water that's used, even just certain times a year, certain days or whatever. And then with the sewer, I think one way to deal with that is that any water that's going into the sewer, you could have some control over that in terms of how much goes into your septic system per day or per month or however it wants to be broken down. Yeah.
And I know from the work on the board that one of the residential neighborhoods had concerns about fire and rescue, getting water, and basically because there's no water out there, then the fire and rescue had to come up with specific plans and measure the houses from the sidewalks and how far they could go with their hoses and have their pump trucks. And worst case scenario, they'd go down to the river and pump water out of the river to take up to fight the fire. It's an interesting, different way of thinking of it if you're from other areas that have hydrants on every corner.
Absolutely. And when I was a young man, we had a fire at our farm that burnt down the old farmhouse that was there. There was nobody in it or anything; it had been abandoned. But we're in a similar situation where the farm is way off the road, and there's no fire hydrant that's close by. And by the time they started putting water on it, the building was completely burned down. So that's a real concern, I think, when it comes to the lack of water down Belle Plains Road, not only for the people that live there every day, but also for the campground. I mean, conceivably, when I camp, I like to have a fire. And so if you have a fire out there at a time like this, it's really dry right now. And if an ember gets away and starts like a brush fire, how do you fight it
Right.
before it gets to somebody's house? And something else I think that should be noted in relation to that is that the parcel that the campground is on surrounds somebody's house. There's a house, and I think it's 10 acres, kind of almost in the middle of it. So everything that's going on in that campground is going to impact the people that live there probably far more, on an everyday basis than everybody else that lives down Belle Plains Road.
Right. All right. On environmental impact, we sort of talked about this, but the Fredericksburg Free Press reported that 41 acres of the proposed projects are wetlands, which is designated as a resource protection area by the Virginia Department of Environmental Equality. So what are your concerns about the wetlands aspect?
So, yeah, the wetlands are a big issue. Wetlands they serve all kinds of purposes in the environment. One of the things they do is they filter. That the wetlands you were talking about not only are along the shore, but there's a thing that we call big marsh down there. It's a big marsh. We're not too fancy when it comes to naming things in White Oak, but it sticks way out in the Potomac Creek, and it serves almost as like this big filter. So things that are coming from upstream, where I think we all know there's a lot of development places like Centerport Parkway and all that stuff that's coming down, that marsh kind of helps filter it out as before it gets to the Potomac River. But also the marshes are important places for bird species. There's a heron rookery nearby, but also it's a spawning area for different kinds of fish like shad and carp, things like that. And one thing that we're dealing with down there right now is erosion of that big marsh. People have started cutting through it at a narrow point that is much closer to the shore than where the channel of the creek is. And I was out there last year, and it was pretty much wide enough where you could get a kayak through it. I was out there this year, eeling, and you could get 3 or 4 kayaks through it abreast. So it's that channel is opening up through there, and it's just going to continue to erode that marsh away, and eventually the large portion of big marsh that sticks out in Potomac Creek will be gone.
Wow. Now, one of the things that's been pushed for sustainable tourism as a mode of traveling, and you sort of address that people would want to go and visit someplace that's and then go and enjoy it type aspect. So somebody could say that this is supposed to be eco-friendly because it's a campsite. They're supposed to be enjoying the area, either going out on the river or taking nature walks or whatnot. So the idea is that this type of footprint is smaller than putting in homes or putting in some other type of business. And so how do you feel about that argument that, it's a smaller footprint, so therefore it's better?
Well, I'm not entirely convinced it's a smaller footprint. I think, as I recall, the property is zoned A1. And Tom, you can correct me on this because you probably know it better than I do. But I think now with the way the down zoning works in the county, A1 is it 6-acre lots?
Yep. Yes, sir.
Yeah. And, the marsh obviously doesn't really count toward that because you can't build on the marsh. So you're looking at maybe 6 houses if you build houses in there. To me, that seems like a pretty small footprint. Not only is it a small footprint, the people that come live there, while they may not be familiar with the area when they first move in, they live there a year or two every day. They become familiar with it very quickly. They integrate into the community, and it just makes it makes more sense in that way. I don't think that the community down there would have gotten so up in arms about 6 houses going in. But eco-friendly, I think a campground sounds eco-friendly, but there are environmental impacts from it, particularly when you get one that's going to be relatively dense. If it goes to the phase 2, it's going to be denser than it is now, and it has all these different kinds of amenities that are using things like septic and drawing water from the aquifer and all that kind of stuff. But I think you have to balance sort of that desire for tourism with the lifeways of a group of people in a place. And it's an area of the county that has long traditions, deep roots, and I think if I were somebody that wanted to start a business somewhere, I would probably go into that community first and kind of like talk to people and kind of feel it what they wanted, and try to work with them, and try to be a good neighbor, and really like do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. I mean, I think if you live by the golden rule, you do pretty well. So I think while it could seem eco-friendly, maybe not. And then I would also argue that there are lots of other places in the area where people can go enjoy nature and even get access to Potomac Creek that aren't right there. So you have Widewater State Park, which has the facilities to handle lots of people coming in and visiting and launching kayaks and doing all that stuff. You also have Crow's Nest, which is held by DCR, which is just across Potomac Creek, and they have a great kayak launch up there, and they have all kinds of trails. And so you can, paddle around and enjoy nature to your heart's content. And actually, it is very much in those two places preserved. There's not a lot of development. Matter of fact, Crow's Nest, it's like a wilderness almost. And Widewater in many ways is the same. There are, houses getting into it, but then once you get into the area that is the park or the natural area, it's very much a natural area.
And so in this project, there was proposed access to the water, to the river, and to the creek, with the idea of going over to Crow's Nest, but there's no landing point on Crow's Nest on that side, if memory serves me. I think if memory serves me, that's where the heron rookery is and such, and that the entrances or the land access points are on the other side of Crow's Nest, if I remember my map of it. So there's really not a way to go there, to get there from here.
That's right. Yeah, a lot of Crow's Nest, if you get out there on Potomac Creek and you spend any time on the water, it's pretty tall cliffs. So there's really, you can maybe get up to the edge of it, but being able to get into Crow's Nest and even there's no trail really that kind of terminates down there. So there's nowhere to like land your kayak or anything like that.
And which was, I know I've been out to Crow's Nest in a kayak and whatnot many years ago, but that was on the other side. And then we went over and saw the cliffs. And I forget which U.S. senator or whatever had tried to build a home or whatever over there because he liked the cliffs type aspect. So I guess the going back to sort of the sticking with tourism as in general, is a lot of tourism. The idea is that it impacts, bringing in other dollars, and people go to restaurants and do things. And online, there's a site that sits an outdoor hospitality management company based in Arizona estimates this, every dollar spent by an RV camper is $10 to $12 circulates in the local economy. So I guess the question would be, if the theory is that you're going to bring in these people to go there, where would they be able to spend money that is going to circulate into the economy?
I think that's an excellent question. There isn't much down around White Oak to go spend your money if you're a camper. I mean, you can go to the Giant Food there on Town and Country Drive and buy you groceries or whatever for the time you're going to be camping. And there's a good barbecue place there now. But my guess is most people, if they're going to want to get out, they're going to have to drive somewhere first thing. So then I think that kind of feeds into the eco-friendly argument. I mean, if you're going there and you're just going to drive everywhere once you get down there, are you really doing good for the environment? I don't know. But second of all, I think, people are going to go to Fredericksburg and spend money because that's where most of the restaurants are. That's where most things are where you can spend money, because I don't think anybody's going to drive up Route 1 or 95 or up 17 to go spend money in Stafford County from down there in White Oak. The people who live in White Oak don't do that. So, I think it's maybe good tourism dollars for the city of Fredericksburg, but maybe not so great for Stafford County.
And I guess one of the questions would be, would there be, we'll say, a domino effect in that, okay, so if on White Oak Road, you now have people, then maybe somebody would take the little store on the corner by on White Oak Road and say, okay, well, we'll upgrade that, or at the corner of Ringgold and Ferry Road and say, oh, well, let's change that. But again, it sort of would be, there'd have to be so much tourism to go and do that. I mean, other than Tilly's, which is an awesome ice cream parlor, and the new barbecue place, the Mexican restaurant, the Jamaican restaurant, and a couple Italian restaurants. There's just nothing until you get over to the city or on the other side of 95.
Yeah, I agree, and I think a lot of people that would come to a campground on Belle Plains Road would not be wilderness type campers who are just gonna, maybe go to the closest thing and grab a bite to eat. I think they're going to be people that want to have sort of a nicer meal when they get there, if they're going to go out and eat, that is. And so I think, to do that, you more or less have to go to town.
And there's, when you were talking about the road, there's not really in most of, and it was a cultural thing about Stafford, about sidewalks and bike trails. So there's really, on so many parts of Stafford, just no way to ride a bicycle, whether you're on Ferry Road or even White Oak Road, even on 17 for certain parts of it. It's just not a cultural thing that we've thought of putting in that, and it's always been a fight to try to get sidewalks in, even tiny little subdivisions, to make it safe for people to go. So, and there's nothing King George wise either for quite a while, correct?
Yeah. I mean, the closest restaurant in King George, I think, to down there at Belle Plains would be Tim's 2 at Fairview Beach.
Right.
I mean, that's pretty close by water, but to drive it there, it's ways
It's
away.
a long haul. Yeah. And I know there's a couple little things in one part of King George, but it's really hard to get them. So, Brad, you had talked about in your description of your career historical and cultural aspects, and Stafford has a lot of historical and cultural elements to it. Is there something in this area of this project that comes to mind?
Yeah, so the area around Potomac Creek in general, and then also within the proposed campground development, is fairly significant historically, and has the potential to have very important archaeological sites. The ancestral villages of the Potomac tribe are at Indian Point, which is just across Potomac Creek from where the campground is, sort of diagonally as you get toward the mouth of the creek. On the other side of the creek in King George is the location of Pass Patanzi, which is another sort of late pre-contact, early contact village that Potomac people lived in. And then in addition to that, you have numerous little hamlets that have been identified, little sort of middle to late woodland period, early contact hamlets occupied by Potomac people in that region. There are a couple sites that are within the boundaries, near and within the boundaries of the campground parcel that were identified in the 1970s and 1980s when an archaeologist named Betty Veach came through the area and did a large sort of surface survey of the Potomac Creek estuary, so all up and down Potomac Creek. There are also numerous archaeological sites that were identified directly across the creek at Crow's Nest. And so what you would find over there, you would probably expect to find similar sites across the creek where the campground is. Stone's Landing has a lot of significant archaeological sites that span the periods from the Archaic, so 8,000 years ago, all the way up essentially to the modern day. But one of Stafford County's courthouses is Stone's Landing, one of the early 18th century courthouses. And so there's high potential for archaeological sites from the 18th century to be in and around the campground parcel. And then, of course, the thing that looms large in Stafford County was only 4 years long, but it was the Civil War. And Belle Plains was a major landing there for the United States Army. And so there is also a very high potential that there could be sites related to that Army occupation of the property in the 1860s. So yes, cultural resources are a major concern. It's often difficult to get those identified because usually there has to be like a hook that creates the need for that sort of survey. So usually it's federal dollars or maybe state permits. Rezoning can do it at the county level, or if it's in like a historic overlay district. So those things could potentially trigger archaeological survey that could identify those kinds of sites. But without, that kind of survey, you don't know what's there. And you also take the chance of destroying highly significant sites to, not only the communities that live in that area, but to Stafford County and perhaps the nation as a whole.
All right. So family recreation, I guess If the people visit the Facebook page for this project, they'll notice multiple entries emphasizing the family-friendly nature of the proposed facility. So let's talk about that a little bit. Would you agree with that it's important for families to have recreational activities in the county? You sort of touched on this with Crow's Nest and with Whitewater State Park.
Yeah, well, so I absolutely agree. I think it's very important for families to get out in nature and enjoy, everything that it can offer. I wouldn't advocate against that at all. As a matter of fact, I think more people need to do that. But, as I mentioned previously, I think we already have some great facilities in the area that people can go to that are far more developed for that kind of recreation, and perhaps are more suited to it. So Whitewater State Park is one, Crow's Nest, obviously, another one. Caledon down in King George is another one. And there are also some camping facilities around already as well. So Caledon has some tent camping facilities, but they're hike or paddle up sites. But I mention that because I just read an article about somebody that did a trip from DC down to Caledon via kayak, and I think it was like a 4-day trip, and they camped along the way at different places. So it's a thing that you can do. There are places available if you take the time and plan it and know how to do it. So I don't think it's necessarily an amenity that we're lacking. I think we have quite a bit of family-friendly sort of ecotourism in this area, and even I would argue that the battlefields are that as well. They're full of trails. That's a great way to get out into nature, and even if you're not interested in the history, it's just a great preserved place that you can go see and enjoy with your family. The family-friendly sort of tourism thing doesn't really sway me, considering we've got so much of it here already.
Right, and it's sort of an interesting. There was way back when the first or second years I was on the board, there was supposed to be a committee formed on the Rappahannock and on the Potomac side to come up with more access points for people to take their boats and whatnot to get on the river. And I said I'd be happy to join on that because my district hits both rivers, and then it never went anywhere. So that was about six years ago. So it's sort of stymied that we have two areas that people could do stuff with, but no real access points to do it. Which is sort of interesting. You have, as you said, we have the Whitewater Park, and we have a couple other little places. And if you go down to the historic Port of Falmouth, you take your little kayak in. But most likely you're going over the city side, and that it's sort of an interesting thing that we took a step forward, and then it just sort of stops. Get stuck in wetlands or something.
Well, yeah, and I think part of it is our geography here. But I would say that we do have, we have water access here. I think you got to maybe drive a little bit for it. But so when it comes to geography, Potomac Creek is not the greatest place to launch, particularly a motorboat, like something with a deep draft, because these days it's fairly shallow. This time of year it's full of weeds. And so it just doesn't lend itself to that kind of thing. And then also, like, all of the land kind of at the end of the road where it would be best to launch a boat is owned privately by the marina on one side and then by, private owners on the other side of the road. But you have places like, you also have great county parks and launches. So you've got Aquapo up there, but you've also got Little Falls Water Treatment Plant where you can get on the Rappahannock River, and that's a pretty good launch. If you want to drive down the road a little bit more, you've got Hop Yard Farm, which is another good launch into the Rappahannock River. And then there's a couple marinas around, of course, up on Aquia Creek, and then down even further down at Potomac in like King George, you got Wall Point Marina, and then down at Fairview, you can launch a boat as well. So there are places to launch boats. I think you just have to kind of look for them. But yeah, I think, the county itself does offer quite a bit in the ways of recreation. So, I mentioned state parks and state agencies earlier, but the county has a lot of parks that are great.
And even on the reservoir, you can go down to the reservoir and do it with certain types with kayaks and whatnot.
Yeah.
All right, so some closing thoughts. What are your final thoughts about this project being considered and in light of the different issues that were discussed and the way forward?
Yeah, so I'll kind of go back to what I started with sort of this half century long tension between development and like local communities and traditional communities in Stafford County. And I think we have moved in the right direction because we're having this conversation. We have what's left of a small traditional community down there on Belle Plains Road. They've been able to organize and they've been able to like express their opinion on this one. Whereas I think if this had happened when I was young, it would have happened, and it actually probably would have been a subdivision with quarter-acre lots. So things have changed in the right direction. I think we still have some ways to go. I think the fact that this falls under by right is what's bothering some people. It's kind of it doesn't make a lot of sense how something that is commercial or maybe even some of these light industrial projects can fall under by right, especially in an agricultural zoning area. Like, how does that fit with agriculture at all? It just doesn't seem like the zoning and the use fits together. And then how does it fall in with the comprehensive plan that the county has? I know the vast majority of development has been slated to happen along the major road corridors. And, I think we've already established that Belle Plains Road is not a major road. So I think there's a kind of a long road ahead on this one. I think the people involved need to take a long, hard look at the impact it has, not only to the environment, but to the people that live down there. Oftentimes, and I've seen this happen in my lifetime, projects happen in our part of the county and, people go in, they make their money, they leave, and then those of us who live there and have lived there for many generations are kind of left holding the bag. And you kind of feel beat down sometimes when that happens. So, I hope that doesn't happen here. And I think more conversation about it and about things to mitigate the impacts would be useful in this situation. And it would be nice if everybody could sit down and sort of express their concerns and their hopes and, maybe find ways to move forward.
And it's sort of interesting. I know when I was on planning commission and on the board, there was a push towards sort of looking at all these different types of zoning and different rules and regulations and sort of bringing them up to the 21st century, because so much of it was done in a different mindset and different time frame. And so that's sort of an ongoing process that is sort of, I think, every community in Virginia is sort of catching up to. Because something that was defined one way 30 years ago or 40 years ago is not the same today. And we saw this with businesses, home businesses, for example, that, when people thought of home businesses way back 20, 40 years ago, it was a certain way. But now it is, you could sell guns from your home. And so can you do that? And it's by right. So there's a lot of things that are just that I think everybody in Virginia needs to sort of revisit and look at that. And then the other thing that's interesting is you do things if it's zoned one way or even gets rezoned a certain way, and then you just sit on it. And then what's allowed or whatever will change, and then you can just slide into it. Way back in the 70s, I guess, they approved an apartment complex near the airport. And it just has sat dormant for all these years. And every now and then it sort of percolates up that they can do it because it's always been there, that they can do it and nobody can stop it now. And so that now that the temperament has changed of we don't necessarily want that there, or we can't handle the road traffic or this, that, and the other, it's like, too bad for you. That's the way it is now. And so it's an interesting shift that we're going through as a community and as a Commonwealth. They deal with things and look at things in a different way. And it's sort of limited that way. But we'll end on a happy note. At the end of the podcast, when we have guests on, we like them to say something nice, or either a story or a reflection or something about Stafford County that makes them feel good. So I'll give you a shot at doing that.
Sure. So in relation to the topic of this interview, I think I'll talk a little bit about sort of my connection to the area down there on Belle Plains Road. I know we mentioned that I don't live down on Belle Plains Road, and I'm not an official spokesperson for the group opposing the campground, but I do have deep roots down there. My great-great-grandfather was a commercial fisherman down there, and my great-grandfather owned a large parcel of property on Potomac Creek up above Stone's Landing. And then my grandfather fished recreationally down there and hunted as well, and would go down. I mentioned earlier in the interview that he would drive down there almost every day until he stopped driving. He would drive down there almost every day to the end of the road and meet with people in the community and his friends, and they'd sit around and enjoy their time down there. And of course, I spend some time down there these days too. So that connection to the landscape for me is what's important about Stafford County, and important to be a part of the community, like that long-term sort of generational knowledge of the place. And it's something you don't see in a lot of places, at least not anymore. And I think that's what colors my opinion of things that happen in the county and how I feel about, new stuff and how things are developing. And I think, as I was growing up, I saw a lot of things change. And I've seen people kind of take a step back these days and kind of think, okay, do we want this rapid kind of change, or do we want to sit and think about the impacts that it has long term? And I'm glad that people are doing that. And I don't know, I'm very proud to be from where I'm from. Even though sometimes I don't always agree with what happens, but I think it's good to have healthy disagreements.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Brad Hatch, and we appreciate you coming here today and telling us some information on this project. Again, we invited the other side to come on, and they declined, but we wanted to make sure that you understood, the people who are seeing these signs and seeing things on the news, what exactly is being discussed. So thanks for taking the time, Brad.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks again to Brad Hatch for his willingness to join in the conversation and offer his thoughts and insights on this project and our county's history. And just a couple personal notes before we close. First, as a former supervisor, I believe that how the community deals with the topic of growth is a larger discussion worth having. I continue to argue that many of our zoning categories and uses need to be updated to accommodate the changing dynamic of the Stafford community. For example, under agricultural zoning, slaughterhouses, lumber mills, livestock, and other traditional agricultural uses are currently allowed. But as more residential communities are put into agricultural zoned areas, otherwise known as A1, the residents may not desire these types of development nearby. But under the current zoning provisions, there is little they can do to prevent it. So I would encourage residents to get involved in the conversation by keeping themselves informed. To help you further understand this project and others, check our links on our Facebook page for not only this project, but also the county's comprehensive growth plan. And finally, this episode is being recorded on the Monday following the assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump. So I think I need to make a couple comments in light of that event. As someone who has been involved in political campaigns and governing all my life, as a candidate, campaign worker, elected, and an appointed official, I've often noted how the political climate in America has disintegrated. We've seen the tone of political attacks escalate. Distortions of somebody's campaign or their record, voting history, or campaign opinions are one thing. But the vitriol that we have seen growing in this country in the last decade is not conducive to the nation moving forward and meeting its challenges. I'm sure we've all seen posts online after the shooting from people who just dislike former President Trump, or those who equally dislike the current President, Biden, saying really vile things. Such remarks neither help their own cause or persuade other people to the validity of their arguments. In fact, given the instincts of human beings to return attacks with attacks, they only serve to make matters worse. We can believe passionately in our views and our candidates, but the escalation of attacks has created a toxic climate for discourse. This climate pits friend against friend, neighbor against neighbor. But I believe there is a different path available. I have friends on the left whose response to the events of this past weekend was just as aggrieved as if it had been their own candidate attacked. And I respect them for that. If we listen to each other, we can learn from each other. I truly believe that. And the result of listening to each other is a positive interchange of ideas that together influence policies and move us forward. My hope is that as we move forward in this election, we might do as former President Lincoln once said, and appeal to the better angels of our nature. And with that, I want to thank you for joining us today. We appreciate you and hope you will refer us to your friends. I also want to give a shout out to Tilly's Homemade Ice Cream for their support of this podcast. Tilly's is located on Route 3 across from George Washington's Ferry Farm. On our next episode of Stafford Connect, we'll sit down with Stafford County Public Schools Chief Academic Officer Michael Bowling and talk a little bit about workforce education in Stafford County. This should be a really good discussion. Until then, I'm Tom Cohen, and you're listening to Stafford Connect Podcast. Stafford Connect is a River's Edge Media original podcast. You can listen to our show anywhere you get your podcast or catch the video on our YouTube channel. Stafford Connect, the conversation begins here.